It's Get Outta Here. I'm Warren Levinson. We're looking backward this week, call it the Turkey Day hangover if you like, at one of our favorite episodes, Beth Harpaz's visit last year to what was then the brand new Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama. A deep dive into the history and after effects of slavery, as well as a companion memorial, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which documents the history and legacy of lynching in America. The episode recently won a gold medal in the podcast category at the Society of American Travel Writers' annual Lowell Thomas Awards. Here it is.
Montgomery, Alabama is a city with a long history connected to both the slave trade and the civil rights era. This spring, 2 new sites have opened in Montgomery that are bringing renewed attention to the horrors of slavery and segregation. One is a memorial to the victims of lynching, and the other is a museum that explores the legacy of these injustices. I'm Beth Harpaz, travel editor for the Associated Press, and this is the AP Travel Podcast, Get Outta Here. Please subscribe to us on iTunes or on Stitcher. I was in Montgomery at the end of April for the opening of the Lynching Memorial and Museum. Today, I want to tell you about my visit and let you hear from some of the people I met while I was there. The new memorial and museum make the case that we have not yet reckoned with the damage done by slavery and racism in this country, and they make the case that we only heal and move forward if we truly acknowledge the past. 10,000 people came to Montgomery for the opening of the memorial and museum, from ordinary citizens to celebrities like Al Gore, John Legend, and Gloria Steinem. One woman I spoke to drove 3 days from California to be there. Her name is Tony Battle, and her journey was a painfully personal one.
I'm a descendant of 3 lynching victims, and I wanted to come and honor them, and also those in my family that could not be here, those in my family that wanted the acknowledgement and lived the pain of their loss.
Filmmaker Ava DuVernay won an Oscar nomination for the movie Selma, about the historic Civil Rights March in 1965 from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery. That march led President Johnson to call for the Voting Rights Act. DuVernay attended the opening of the Lynching Memorial Museum, and at a conference that week in Montgomery, she talked about how the Memorial Museum came to be. They're the brainchild of Bryan Stevenson. He's an anti-death penalty activist and a lawyer who's won cases in the U.S. Supreme Court. He's also a MacArthur Genius Award winner and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. That's the Montgomery organization responsible for the museum and memorial. Here's what DuVernay had to say at the launch event for the museum and memorial.
This has to be a place where every American that believes in justice and dignity must come here.
Later, Bryan Stevenson himself spoke, tying the opening events to one of the most important moments in the civil rights era, which also happened in Montgomery, when a seamstress named Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a city bus to a white man.
We are standing on the shoulders of something remarkable that happened in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. We should never forget the way the civil rights movement found its legs, found its voice, found its stride here in Montgomery, Alabama. And there's an important story, and I'm so concerned that we not forget this story. We want to tell this story one more time, because a lot of people don't know it. And tonight I want us to reflect and think about the extraordinary Montgomery bus boycott.
Montgomery is home to a museum dedicated to Rosa Parks. Here's a tour guide, Desma Edwards, standing on the very spot where Parks was arrested.
Actually, the point where she was taken off the bus and arrested right here. The building now is a library museum, but it is a historical museum that's going to tell the life of Mrs. Rosa Parks and the start of the Montgomery bus boycott, the start of the civil rights movement, as far as how far we have come and how far we can go.
And that's not the only place in Montgomery where you can stand in the footsteps of civil rights legends. A must-see here is the Dexter Parsonage. That's the house where a young minister named Martin Luther King Jr., with his bride Coretta, arrived straight out of divinity school. Parks was arrested a short time later, and overnight, at the age of 24, Martin Luther King Jr. became the leader of the civil rights movement. You'll see the crater on the porch of the house where he lived, where a bomb was thrown. and you'll see the phone in the hallway outside the king's bedroom, where the family sometimes received dozens of threatening anonymous phone calls every night. After each tour, visitors head into the backyard, join hands, and sing.
Keep on talking, marching up to freedom.
It's a hopeful moment, as is another sing-along on a bus tour of Montgomery with a woman named Michelle Browder.
You ready? Oh yeah! Gotta get you ready!
Browder also works with young people in the community to expand their opportunities, and she cites Bryan Stevenson as an inspiration, both to the kids she works with and for her tour company, which is named More Than Tours, after something Stevenson is famous for saying.
So we organized a trip to the United States Supreme Court to witness Bryan Stevenson argue Evan Miller versus Alabama and Jackson versus Hobbs. And he won not one, but two of those court cases. My students came back. It was 56 of them, black and brown, never been outside of Montgomery, Alabama. They were like, we need more. Whatever this is, you got to give us more. There's this quote that he says all the time, that we are all more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And
Bryan
says it resonated with me.
We are all more than the worst thing we have ever done. Words to live by, for sure. One of the things that the new museum in Montgomery and Browder's tour make clear is that this city was a center of the slave trade. The museum is built on the site of a warehouse where enslaved people were held, and it's located steps from an auction site where tens of thousands of human beings were bought and sold. When the Civil War began, Montgomery was the first capital of the Confederacy. The new museum has a long and complex name. It's called the Legacy Museum, from enslavement to mass incarceration. The museum contends that slavery was merely replaced by segregation and Jim Crow, and later by policies that have resulted in the mass incarceration of African Americans. Stevenson's work at the Equal Justice Initiative includes representing innocent black men who have spent decades on death row. He also represents children who have been tried as adults and jailed in adult prisons where they were brutalized. Here's a Montgomery resident who visited the museum in its opening days. Her name is Shauna Brannon.
It can be very overwhelming, I'll say that. I did not quite make it through the whole. I had to actually stop because I was too overwhelmed.
I've got a lot more to tell you about visiting Montgomery, Alabama, when we come back in a moment. Back at the Lynching Memorial, visitors wander among 800 steel slabs inscribed with the names and dates of more than 4,000 lynching victims. There's one steel marker for each county in the United States where lynchings have taken place. Most are in the South, but many visitors are surprised to see lynching victims memorialized from places like Minnesota, Colorado, New York. The memorial also lists some of the reasons for individual lynchings. A man asked for a glass of water, asked to be paid more, interacted with a white person in a way that was deemed unacceptable. A woman was lynched for protesting the lynching of her husband. Many of those visiting the memorial were in tears as they scrutinized the markers. The columns start out at eye level on the ground, but gradually they're positioned higher and higher until they're hanging down from above, the way you might imagine a hanging body. Some visitors describe themselves as emotionally overcome by the experience, yet the memorial has an oddly hopeful name, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, suggesting that perhaps this reckoning of past wrongs would pave the way for healing. Among the visitors I spoke to were 3 young people from Baltimore. They had driven 13 hours to see this place. They're all fans of Bryan Stevenson, and one of them, Celia Segbe, talked to me about what the experience was like for her.
By people coming here alone, they're seeing the kind of things this country has done to black people. So I am really, my black friends know, but I am telling my white friends, you have to come to Montgomery. You have to see this. So you have to come here to confront these things in order for us to start healing, in order for us to start forgiving, in order for our white friends to understand white supremacy and what it has done to black lives.
Montgomery tourism officials expect something like 100,000 more visitors in the next year because of these new sites. I've had a number of people, black and white, tell me they had no interest in visiting Alabama until now, but they're planning trips. One visitor told me he thinks the new sites have rebranded the city. The mayor told me they're even starting new initiatives to train more workers for jobs in the hospitality industry. A couple other things worth considering for an itinerary here, in addition to the new memorial and museum: the Dexter Parsonage, where Martin Luther King lived, and the Rosa Parks Museum, of course. There's also a museum about the Freedom Rides. That was another important chapter in civil rights history, when a group of black and white students who were riding Greyhound buses to challenge segregation arrived in Montgomery and were attacked by a white mob while local police did nothing. That led the Kennedy administration to send federal marshals in. As travel editor, I'm always looking for offbeat things to add to itineraries as well, so I'm just going to rattle off a couple of other points of interest. There's a museum about the lives of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, and his wife Zelda. There's even an Airbnb apartment upstairs from the museum that you can rent. And for country music fans, there's a Hank Williams museum and an impressive memorial at his gravesite. And of course, there's lots of good Southern food. My favorite meals were lunches, fried chicken, catfish ribs, turnip greens, and fried okra at places like Davis Cafe, Farmers Market Cafe, and Filet and Vine. There's a pecan store where you can buy bags of nuts and have butter pecan ice cream. And for a wonderful fancy dinner, Vintage Year. The city also hosts a Shakespeare Festival. But at least for visitors making the trip to Montgomery for the first time, the Lynching Memorial will likely be the centerpiece of any trip. Perhaps you're already familiar with the famous Billie Holiday song, Strange Fruit. If so, you may know that it was originally written as a poem protesting a lynching in Indiana in 1930 of 2 black men. That lynching attracted thousands of spectators, and a famous photo shows white people gawking in a celebratory way at the hanging bodies. The song Strange Fruit has been re-recorded by Andra Day, and a haunting video was made and shown at the memorial launch.
Silent tree, bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves, and blood at the root.
Take a look online and give a listen, and consider making the pilgrimage yourself.
Beth Harpaz was the Associated Press travel editor and the founder of this podcast. Back with a new episode next week. I'm Warren Levinson. We'll see you next time.